conditional examination of Lisa DiPaolo on April 18, 2018, stating under California Rules of Court 4.111B, the failure to file and serve timely points and authorities without good cause can be treated as an admission that the motion is not valid. So now we find ourselves, and literally the day before Mr. Greenhouse is going to testify, they bring up an issue which is 4 years old. So that's the basis. Let's look at what they actually say with respect to their legal position. Mr. Lewis sent an email. The first thing that he says in the email is he says that the problematic testimony concerns statements allegedly made to Greenfield by Barnes about words uttered by Berman. The defense criticizes the fact that I used a leading question with respect to the foundation for the prior consistent statement. That is admissible pursuant to People versus Collins. That's at 49 Cal 4th at 175, which says that leading questions are permissible under Evidence Code sections 764 and 767 as to prior statements and inconsistencies. So that legal position is wrong. Mr. Lewis then says that the prior consistent statement was apparently, quote, triggered by, my claim that it was triggered by defense cross-examination is both hollow and transparent. And they say, quote, the truth is the people long ago contemplated setting up this straw man as illustrated on page 29 through 30 of the attached transcript. Clearly it was not the cross-examination of Barnes that led the people to claim Barnes' alleged statements to Greenhouse are potentially admissible. It is true that absolutely I recognized as soon as I spoke to Miriam Barnes that her testimony would be devastating to the defense. It would be devastating because the allegation that they have made repeatedly that all of these statements by Susan Berman are a product of what people watched on TV in the Jinx will not work with Miriam Barnes because she made the statement to Mr. Greenhouse back in 2000 before anything was ever aired. So I understood they were going to have to go over this, and in fact I said during my interview 12 December of 2016 with Mr. Greenhouse, quote, there is 100% certainty that we're going to end up bringing Miriam to court. I later added, it is also likely that we would bring you in as well because your testimony we will be using to support her credibility. That's in the transcript. Mr. Lewis goes on further to say that, in essence, this is a violation of Crawford. Now, if you look at 1236, what Mr. Lewis is doing is he's citing the pre-1965 authority before the Evidence Code was promulgated. The Evidence Code itself clearly states, and the quote is not debatable, says very clearly, quote, under existing law, a prior statement of a witness that is consistent with his testimony at the trial is admissible under certain conditions when the credibility of that witness has been attacked. That was the original statement, and that is from originally Kynett, K-Y-N-E-T-T, at 15 Cal 2nd, 731. It continues. Section 1236, however, permits a prior consistent statement of a witness to be used as substantive evidence if the statement is otherwise admissible under the rules relating to the rehabilitation of impeached witnesses. See Evidence Code Section 791. This is further reflected in Cal Crim 318, which covers prior statements as evidence and says, quote, you have heard evidence of a statement that a witness made before trial. If you decide that the witness made the statement, you may use those statements in two ways. One, to evaluate whether the witness's testimony in court is believable, and two, as evidence that the information in those earlier statements is true. Finally, Mr. Lewis in his email talks about the fact that this is testimonial. It is obviously not testimonial. Crawford applies to statements that are made, in essence, formalized statements that are the equivalent of testimony, which would be statements to the police, etc. There have been a legion of cases of 791 and 1236 going to the court in California since Crawford was decided in 2004. There is direct authority that is contrary to counsel's position. That is Ohio versus Clark, which is a U.S. Supreme Court case at 576 U.S. 237 in 2015, there's also direct contrary authority in People versus Smith, a 2017 case at 12 Kellap 5th at 766, at 787, and 788. Finally, and I got to give Chip credit, you got to be real careful when you bring up Plessy versus Ferguson. To call that a strained analogy in this case would be charitable.
All right, thank you. All right, the prior consistent statement is admissible. I'll cite People versus Charles Manson, 61 Kellap 3rd 102 at page 287, 1976 case, which a notable case in which a prior consistent statement was admitted. This is not testimonial. Look at Giles versus California, 554 U.S. 353. Statements to friends and neighbors, in that case about domestic violence, are not testimonial and are barred only by state hearsay rules. People versus Riccardi, 54 Cal 4th 758, disapproved on other grounds, but in this case is still good law. California's Supreme Court considered this a statement made by a murder victim to a friend at a school shortly before the homicide. She expressed concern the defendant would attempt to molest her later that day when she returned home. That statement was not testimonial. The listener was a friend. Did you wish to say something else?
Your Honor, I would say just, probably the court has picked up on this given your wisdom. I just inherited Mr. Greenhouse Friday.
Okay, I don't blame you for.
I didn't think you would.
No, but let me say that also. I mean, the suggestion that there's something wrong with the preparation of the witness, anticipating the objection and preparing the witness to give the consistent statement. I must say it's brilliant lawyering by Mr. Lewin and Mr. Balian, who are using the evidence code as it was intended as a guide for preparation of their case. That's the idea.
I would agree, Your Honor. In our very collegial discussion, Mr. Lewin pointed out the reason this was admissible was because of my cross-examination. I'm simply pointing out it wasn't my cross-examination at all.
If you had passed the witness,
might be a different story.
Different story, but you couldn't, could you?
Could not.
You had to, and this is what happens. And so this is the way it unfolds.
For purposes of the record, Your Honor, may I tender what I promised to the clerk for the court's record?
You may.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right. Shall we get our jurors?
Thank you.
All right. I guess we lodge them. Because I have it, yeah. All right.
You're muted. face the flag of our nation and recognize the principles for which it stands. Department 1 is now in session. The Honorable Mark E. Windham, Judge, presiding.
Please be seated, everyone. Good morning. Welcome back to Department 1, People versus Robert Durst. Mr. Durst is present. And he's with Mr. Chesnov and Mr. DeGuerin, Mr. Lewis. We have, oh, there's Mr. Balian and Mr. Lewin. I saw him earlier. But, okay, and Mr. Miata, Mr. Milius. We have Mr. Henderson at council table. We've,
Mr. Bailey and I would like to talk to you on the side for a moment.
oh, okay. This is one of our rare sidebars. Let me take a moment to see what this is about. We can, I brought a pillow. Do you think if we gave you one of the court's rolling chairs? That'd be better? Yeah, why don't we roll that into the aisle? And
We don't have 23 of them though, so.
Sorry, guys. It's all a ruse. I just wanted a better chair.
juror number 10, if you're more, juror number 10, I don't know if, let's see, now that's the only other
I know.
issue
No, I'm
is
okay.
you want to scoot over one seat. I know you're kind of close to our lectern, but if we can be mindful of that, maybe we can maintain adequate distance.
Okay.
Very much appreciated.
Sure, sure. Well, thank the lawyers from each side noticed. So
That's a better view.
that's good. Okay. And then when we use the council use the lectern, make sure you scoot over just a little bit more past that green dot, and I'll remind you. All right, but at this point, we're not using the lectern. We're returning to the video recording of testimony by Miriam Barnes. So, again, we treat this as the same as a testimony from a live witness, treated equally. Mr. Henderson, you may begin the recording.
Thank you, Your Honor. Again, this is the testimony of Miriam Barnes. It's gone back about 6 seconds. This is 45 minutes and 2 seconds. We have an hour and 4 minutes left.
House here.
Very scared.
Please do your best to articulate it the best you can as to your state of mind and why you didn't go to the police with this information.
Because I was very frightened of him. It started everything, I started thinking about his wife and then Susan, and I'm going, oh my God, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I'm just so scared, I don't want to, I don't want to have anything to do with this. And it was petrifying. I still am.
Who were you afraid for?
Me.
Was there anyone else other than you that you were afraid for?
No.
As time passed, in the years that followed, 2 or 3 years that followed, did you go to the police then?
No.
Did you learn anything new that made you even more afraid?
Of the man in Texas.
What did you learn and how did it affect your decision not to come forth to the police?
That Robert Durst will kill anybody who will talk against him.
Please tell us, what have you heard about the man in Texas?
It was on the news. It was in the newspapers that he had murdered a man, cut him up. It was scary. It was like, it just compounded everything for me. I don't have anything to do with this.
When you say he, I assume you're talking about Robert Durst.
Yes.
Do you know an individual named Stephen Greenhouse?
Yes.
Who is that?
He's a childhood friend, who's still a friend.
You've known him for many years.
All my life.
How did you meet him? What's the familial relationship between?
Stephen's mother and my mother went through school grew up together, and they were only children, and so we were like family.
Okay. Did you ever go to school with Stephen?
No.
Have you kept in touch with Mr. Greenhouse throughout the years?
Yes.
What was his occupation before?
He went to labor college for being a hunter.
Does he still do that?
No, he retired a year ago, 2 years.
Did you have any other professions other than being a reporter?
He's a lawyer.
After Susan Berman's murder in Phoenix, did you ever contact Stephen Green?
Yes.
About how long after this funeral you went to and the realization that Bobby Durst was involved?
Either a few weeks or maybe a month, because the reason I had the Christmas party is I had friends visiting from friends with children.
Now, you say he was a friend, and you say he was a reporter. In what capacity were you calling him? Were you calling him as a reporter? Were you calling him as a friend? Why were you calling him?
I was calling him as a friend, as a lawyer, as one of the most ethical people I know.
He's also a lawyer?
Yes.
So when you spoke with Greenhouse, did you tell him about this conversation you had with Susan Berman years earlier?
Yes.
That we've been discussing here today?
Yes.
What did Greenhouse, if anything, tell you?
He said I had to call the authorities. I had to. He's very ethical. And, yeah.
How adamant was he that you should come forward?
He said, I understand, and you have to do what you have to do, but this is very important. He tried to get me to come forward.
At that time, was he successful
No.
in trying to convince you?
No.
Why not?
I just wasn't ready. I was too scared.
For the record, Stephen Greenhouse is STEVENGRENHOUSE.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For the court reporter, just make life easier.
What exactly was Stephen Greenhouse's option to the best of your opinion?
That I should come forward. That it was my obligation.
Was he saying who you should come forward to, if you remember?
Well, first it was to the authorities, and then it was, well, do you rather talk to a reporter? And I said neither.
You didn't want to talk to anyone?
I didn't want to talk to him.
Were you aware eventually of a show entitled The Jinx that aired on HBO?
I was aware of it, yes.
Did you watch that show?
No, I had none.
Is there a particular reason you didn't watch it?
Just seeing by others. Friends.
Okay. Did you hear about what happened on the show?
Oh, everybody had to tell me.
Did you ever have a conversation with Stephen Greenhouse about what happened on the show?
Yeah.
Was anyone present when you had this conversation with Stephen Greenhouse?
His wife.
His wife?
I think my brother was there, my nephews, and my mom. It was at my mom's house. They were coming to visit her. She passed in October, and on Sundays people would come. They were family. They would come to see her.
And when you say his wife, are you referring to Stephen Greenhouse as well?
Yes, Miriam Barnes.
And Miriam, same spelling as your name?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Reinhardt, REINHARTH. did you, after they told you what had been going on in the James, tell them again about this conversation you had had with years earlier?
I think so. We just talked. It was a lot of talk. I maybe was feeling a little editing myself because my mom was in the room.
Okay. At that point in time, did Mr. Greenhouse again urge you to come forth to somebody?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Who was he trying to get you to come forth?
Well, he had a friend who was a reporter who was working on the story, and would I talk to him?
Did what you heard them tell you about what happened or what was displayed on the James affect your state of mind about whether you should or shouldn't come forth with this information to somebody? In other words, do you understand the question?
Yes, I do. I'm just trying to think because I really tried to stay away from that show. But when everybody was telling me about what he said at the end, yes.
What is it that affected you?
That he admitted killing these people.
When you say you're talking about Robert Durst?
Yes.
Do you know of someone named Charles Bagley?
Yes, I do.
Who is that?
He's a reporter that called me.
How did you come in contact with Mr. Bagley?
By telephone. He called me.
He called you. Did you know how he got your number?
Steven asked me if it would be okay.
Okay, so Steven asked you if what would be okay?
If Charlie Bagley phoned me.
Did you agree that you would speak with Charlie Bagley?
Yes.
And he contacted you?
Yes.
About how long ago was your time?
And it was about a year and a half ago.
Let me ask you this. Were you aware at some point in time that Mr. Durst had been arrested on this case?
No.
You never became aware that he had been arrested and charged with murder of Susan Berman?
No. I don't think I thought about it. I don't think I remember.
Okay.
I didn't want to follow it. I just wanted to be left alone.
Just trying to establish a timeline. Let me ask it this way. How long was it approximately after you heard about the James? Was it that you eventually spoke with Charlie Bagley?
Maybe a few weeks.
Okay. So it was not years later?
No.
It was close period to that time?
Yes.
It was close in time to that event? Yes?
Yes.
Did you initially when you spoke with Charlie Bagley, did you tell him you did? Initially?
No.
The next time, did you speak with him on multiple occasions?
Yes.
The second time you spoke with him, did you tell him you did?
He asked me questions about Susan, as being a friend of Susan's, and he would question me and talk to me about that. And I said, and I answered a lot of his questions, but we had an understanding that he could never use my name and it can't go in the paper.
Okay. Describe to the court, did you initially, during those first couple of conversations, disclose to Charlie Bagley this conversation you had with Susan Berman years prior?
I didn't right away.
How persistent was Mr. Bagley in calling you and trying to get information from you?
On and off, but when he did speak to me, he was persistent.
When you say he was persistent when he spoke, can you tell us what you mean by that? How was he persistent?
Well, about using my name, about getting, he did a lot of questioning, I remember him even, about Susan's her phobias and her kind of craziness, and he would say, and I remember him saying, how could you be her friend? You know, but you just were her friend.
Okay. Was he ever persistent in getting you to allow him to use your name and put what you said in this article?
Yes.
How persistent was he in that?
The last two maybe conversations we had.
Did you eventually agree to let him use your name and give the information you had provided him about the conversation in an article?
Yes.
Why did you eventually agree to do that?
First he told me that Bobby Durst was very ill.
Why?
He told me that Bobby was very ill. So to be honest, and people in the room, it's a terrible thing to say, but I was hoping that I would never have to come to this because he would be dead.
Okay.
And my mother had just passed, and so nothing could. I was tired. He called me at work at 8 o'clock in the morning or something, 8:30 in the morning, and
You just testified that you heard he was ill. You thought he would probably die relatively quickly. You testified that your mother had just passed away. I believe you testified that you were tired. He called you 8:30 in the morning. Is it fair to say that he kind of caught you at a weak point?
Yes.
For the reasons you testified to, you hoping that you wouldn't have to testify because Robert Durst, given his age and condition, would die. The fact that your mother had just passed away, the fact that you were at a weak point in your life, the fact that it was 8:30 in the morning, the fact that you were tired. Did Charlie Bagley eventually catch you at a weak point, a weak moment, where you agreed to give your name?
yeah,
Agreed to allow you to use your name?
yes.
How much did you consider the consequences of that decision that day to let Charlie Bagley read your name in this article with this information?
I didn't.
If you could do it again, would you allow Mr. Bagley to print what you told him with your name?
No,
Why not?
I don't want to be here.
Why not?
So I'm going to bring Susan back. And it's very frightening to be here.
Are you still scared of Robert Durst?
Yes.
Did you read this Charlie Bagley article?
One with me in it?
Yes.
He emailed it or texted it to me. I was at work and he called and said, "Did you read it?" And I was in such a, not want denial that usually in the morning when I was driving to work, there's a 7-Eleven around the corner from my house, and I would stop and pick up the Times, and that morning I just kept driving.
Did you eventually read it?
He sent it to me.
Did you read it?
He said, "Yes, of course I did."
Was it accurate?
Yes.
So, Susan, let's just, you don't want to be here, we're going to return here tomorrow as well, and that'll be at 10 o'clock. So did you not speak with any other witness about your testimony? Resume the witness stand, you remain your oath. Mr. Lewis is here to cross-examine. You may. Proceed. You may proceed.
Good morning, Mrs. Barnes. I'm sorry, Ms. Barnes. My name is Chip Lewis. I've never had the pleasure of meeting you before. We haven't spoken on telephone. I assure you, Ms. Barnes, that this is going to be a much more congenial exercise than what we've experienced in the last couple of days. Before I get into the meat of the questions I have, I want to clarify one thing. You were married. You married Gerald in 1978?
Yeah.
Prior to your testimony here yesterday, you have met and or spoken with the prosecution several times, correct?
A few times, yes.
At least 5 times.
Okay.
First, on December 27th of 2016 in the morning, they called you at your office, correct?
Yes.
Later that evening, they called you back at your home.
Yes.
You spoke again with members of the prosecution on January 27th of 2017.
I don't have the dates written down, but that's what it is. It is.
That sound about right, ma'am?
Yes.
You again spoke with the prosecution on April the 3rd of 2017.
Yes, sir.
Fresh March 3rd. Sound about right?
Sounds right.
And then, at least last, a couple days ago when you got here to Los Angeles with Detective Camacho and Mr. Bailey.
Yes.
That first call to your office, in the morning time, I believe it was?
Yes.
The later call to your house in the evening, do you remember about what time that was? Before or after dinner?
It had to be after 7 because I didn't get home. I didn't get home from work till after 7.
You would agree with me that all told on the 27th, you spoke with the prosecution for almost an hour and a half.
I didn't look at the clock, but it seemed like a long time.
On that note, would you be surprised to learn, Ms. Barnes, that you spoke a total of 4,261 words during that almost 90 minutes?
We had it at 4,273.
Would you be surprised?
No.
Well, it's fair to say Mr. Lewin had a lot to say. Is that a fair statement? Let me tell you this, Mark. This isn't a trick question. I've had the pleasure of hundreds of conversations with Mr. Lewin, and I realize it's hard to get a word in edgewise. Would you agree with that?
No.
Well, Mr. Bailey and Detective Jamali were also on the phone for those two calls, right?
Yes.
You recall either one of them saying a word?
Yes.
After hello.
Yes.
Yesterday, Ms. Barnes, the prosecution went to great lengths to establish your level of certainty regarding what I would call the Susan Berman conversation. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
You got to answer yes or no.
Yes.
You will call Mr. Bailey and ask you how sure are you about Susan Berman saying yes. How certain are you about Susan Berman saying why? Recall those questions?
Yes.
I want to explore the X, Y, and Z for just a few minutes. First of all, there was conversation about whether or not Ms. Berman, what she told you, whether she added that this was a good or bad thing that she had done. Recall that?
Right. Yes.
Slide one, please. We can do it this way.
This moment. And adjust the inputs.
You're on hold right now. Approach Ms. Barnes so she can have a copy.
Good way.
Ma'am, for ease of reference, I'm going to give you a copy of what we're going to examine relative to this statement. Ms. Barnes, did you have a chance to look at that?
Yes, I did.
So relative to the statement or the issue of whether or not Ms. Berman disclosed to you whether what she had done was good or bad, do you recall Mr. Lewin asking you about that originally? And if I'm reading correctly, the question was, could you just repeat it? If you pretend you're Susan right now, and if you just say, hey, what'd she say in the best of your memory? Your response, something, I did something today. or whether that she said, you know, I don't know whether she said it was good or bad. Correct?
Correct.
And then 30 seconds later, Mr. Lewin asked you, makes a statement. And when you said you weren't sure if it was good or bad, what she had done, but you also mentioned that she was distraught. Again, I want to make sure I'm not putting words in your mouth. I'm just trying to understand it the way you're describing it. It doesn't sound like it was a good thing she did. And your answer was?
Didn't seem like it, but I didn't know for sure.
But after Mr. Lewin's description there, your answer wasn't I wasn't sure, it was right. Correct?
Yeah.
In fairness to you, Ms. Barnes, after having said you weren't sure, you agree with Mr. Lewin's contention, right?
Yes.
Because you couldn't recall whether she had actually said it was good or bad from her words, her mouth, could you?
No.
Now, you mentioned yesterday, understandably, that you were concerned for your safety relative to making any disclosure about hearing this conversation that you had with Ms. Berman. Did I catch that right?
Many years later, but not at that time.
In the years since then, that, as you told this court, held you back from coming, is that fair?
Yes.
Now, do you recall when you spoke with Mr. Lewin, y'all discussed concerns for your safety?
Yes.
Do you recall that Mr. Lewin shared your concern for your safety? He repeated that to you, correct?
He understood what I was saying, yes.
Mr. Bailey, call 1, page 18, 8 through 13. You have that? Will you take a look, Ms. Barnes, at lines 8 through 13?
Call Article 2.
This is called page 18.
Oh, 18. Sorry.
It's okay. 1 second, Ms. Barnes. We got to get this back. Yes. You got that, Ms. Barnes?
Yes.
So, Mr. Lewin is telling you, relative to y'all's discussion about your concerns, that someone from Mr. Durst's defense team may try to contact you.
Yes.
And that admonition certainly didn't make you feel safer, did it?
No.
And in fact, Mr. Lewin's admonition, when a gentleman named David Fetchheimer called you, you declined to speak with him.
Yes, I did.
And you understood, ma'am, that Mr. Fetchheimer was a representative and investigator for Mr. Durst's legal team.
Yes.
And after declining to speak to Mr. Fetchheimer, you followed Mr. Lewin's directive, and you called to tell him that Mr. Fetchheimer was gone. Well, let's make sure I didn't miscapture anything. I promise you this is going to be congenial. I promise. Let's go to page 2, call 2, page 29. lines 16 through 27. Read that to yourself, Ms. Barnes, for reasons of expediency.
Yeah.
So, in that conversation, Mr. Good, again, this is the second call, reiterated his concerns, has contacted you. You're right.
Yes.
That's different from the first call. This is the second call, right?
Yes, so, yes. You have the information.
To be clear, Ms. Barnes, Bob Durst has never threatened you.
No.
Neither before nor after the article was published in the New York Times.
That's correct.
In fact, after your testimony here yesterday, you did not receive any threats, did you? Actually, as you stated yesterday, based on your interaction with Mr. Durst at that party many years ago, you probably thought he was an arrogant asshole.
Yes.
Creepy.
Excuse me?
Creepy.
Kind of, yeah.
Not threatening.
No.
Let's turn a minute. I want to make sure I accurately capture your description of your friend, Susan Berman. Some of what was called characteristics. I believe you said she had a larger-than-life personality.
Correct.
Like to be the center of attention.
I didn't say that.
I believe you said she did not turn away from being the center of attention. You recall that?
No.
Okay. The more dramatic the situation, the better for her liking.
I never said that.
Moody,
I didn't use those words.
a lot of issues,
Yes.
mental breakdowns,
Yes.
fall apart mentally,
Yes.
and lastly, mental health issues.
I know that she saw a psychiatrist.
And given your PhD and your very
I don't have a PhD. I have a master's.
Given your master's and your craft, these are terms that are understood by you very well.
Yes.
Ms. Bailey, I also asked you about Ms. Berman's statement of who she did something for. You recall that?
Yes.
And again, he wanted to highlight your level of certainty, right?
Yes.
Let's talk about that subject for one moment. Slide 2, please. All right, you see the caption, did Susan say who she did something for?
Yes.
Now, I'm going to read this so it's in the record, making sure I've covered my bases. Mr. Lewis, did she say who, Marie, did she say who, in reference to, she was doing something for or anything like that? Your answer, no. Not that I remember. Maybe, but I don't remember. Now, Mr. Lewis talks to you about that yet again. This time he says, yeah, on a scale of 1 to 100, with 1 being you're not sure at all, and 100 being you're absolutely positive, that Susan leaned forward to you and said, Bobby asked me to do something and I did it. Your answer, 99. All right, I read that correctly?
For the record, the two quotes that are on the slide, they're from 2 different interviews at 2 different times.
I appreciate that, Mr. Bailey. That's what I'm about to ask. So, from the morning to the night, we see the difference from left to right, correct?
Yes.
And for the record, your answer in the morning was after Mr. Lewin's question, correct? Your answer? Okay. Your answer in the evening was in response to Mr. Lewin's inquiry, correct?
Correct.
Do you recall, Ms. Barnes, that there was a question about whether or not you connected the statement Susan Berman was saying to you to the fact that Kathy was missing? Remember talking about that?
Yes.
All right. Slide 3, please. Relative to this testimony you gave yesterday, you were asked about this by Mr. Lewin back in December of 2016, correct?
Yes.
And that was those phone calls that we've talked about, one in the morning, one in the evening, right?
Yes.
In the morning call, Mr. Lewin says, so, during, so. This is what I'm trying to figure out, Miriam. So now, during this conversation, she tells you that Kathy has disappeared in the way that she told you. Was she implying, or was she stating directly that Kathy just kind of took off with somebody? Or was she implying that Bobby had done something and had something to do with it? Your answer. I don't think she was trying to imply Bobby had anything to do with it. Your answer, right?
Yes. Can I say one thing? The difference between the...
I'm sorry, that's my fault.
The slide is, he asked a question that did not pertain to this slide.
Right.
I think perhaps a mistake.
Why not?
The witness, the peer witness, is asking to respond.
I want to explain that when they first called me that morning at work, I was so nervous and frightened when they first called. I didn't expect a call from them. It was very early in the morning. I was ready to start work. I had patients banging on my door. I just wanted to get them off the phone.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
May continue your process.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Bailey, I didn't give you. No, I put it wrong. I want to make sure you have this. All right. Let me backtrack. More technical difficulty at this moment. For the discussion about whether you connected the statements that Susan Berman made to you about she did something today to if something has to be bodied, were those connected in the conversation? Remember that?
Yes.
Okay. So Mr. Lewin, again, so, she, and so, what I'm trying to get at is she is saying, so she's saying, I've done something. And then, does she immediately, at that point, say, if something happens to me, Bobby did it? Or were they separate kind of things? Your answer. It was part of the same conversation.
Yes.
All that?
Yes.
Then Mr. Lewin, when he calls you later on this same subject, says, and so, I did something today. And then immediately, if something I did something today, if something happens to me, Bobby did it. Your answer?
Yes. Yeah.
You would agree with me, Ms. Barnes. Obviously, your answer when Mr. Lewin goes at this the first time is different than the second time.
It was part of the same conversation.
I agree. What Mr. Lewin is getting at in a second, you'll notice, is the immediacy. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Last but not least, I think you'll recall what I started to ask you about a second ago for the technical difficulty of whether you connected what Susan was saying to the fact that Kathy was missing. Remember talking about that yesterday?
Yes.
Okay. Slide 4, please. Mr. Lewin asked you, this is on the evening call, and so, during this, what I'm trying to figure out, Miriam, so now, during this conversation, she tells you that Kathy has disappeared. And the way that she told you, was she implying, or was she stating correctly, that Kathy just kind of took off with somebody? Or was she implying that Bobby had done something to do with it? Your answer. I don't think she was trying to imply that Bobby had anything to do with it. Recall that?
Yeah.
So,
And I said that yesterday.
I'm quarreling with what you said yesterday. We're talking about the genesis of these statements. Fair?
Okay.
On the right hand of the screen, let me read what Mr. Lewis said to you. Okay. And obviously, and again, I want to be clear on this. I'm in no way judging you at all. I'm just trying to understand, as I'm listening to this, and you're finding out that during the same conversation that Kathy is missing, I'm just trying to understand whether it was you kind of didn't figure out what's going on, or was it more like, I don't want to be involved in this, I don't even want to think about what she was saying? Your answer. I think it was, I don't want to know. Right? Let's focus on, you can take it. Our discussion about connecting the conversation you had with Ms. Berman to Kathy missing, and whether or not what Susan was saying, whether she directly or she implied it was bad. You may have said this, but I want to be clear, Ms. Barnes. You came to those conclusions through your own supposition, correct?
Yes.
Because Susan never told you this.
Never told me what you think.
That Kathy was missing was a result of the call she had allegedly made or done for
No, she did not.
Nor did she tell you that what she had done was a bad thing.
That's true.
Similarly, towards the end of your testimony yesterday, and I'm not quarreling with your personal opinion, I think you're perfectly entitled to it. You gave some opinions on your thoughts about Mr. Durst's complicity in Susan's death. You remember that?
Yes.
No. This was after you had been told a number of things from people you know and love about the TV series on HBO, The Jinx. This was after things you had read or also heard about Mr. Durst's prior legal cases, right?
Yes. And it was also, I said, I remembered it at Susan's funeral.
Right. What I'm getting at is, you stated your opinion about Mr. Durst's complicity relative to Susan's death. You remember that?
Yes.
That also, like these two statements, was based on supposition from things you've been told about the Jinx, things you've read, correct?
Things I read. It wasn't from the Jinx. I thought it before, that's why I didn't watch the Jinx. And I had come to the supposition at Susan's funeral.
Very fair. That was your supposition.
Yes.
Now, let's talk about Susan's funeral for a moment, man. At that funeral, there were a number of loved ones, family members, people that were very close to her.
Yes.
And you attended that very service and talked with those folks. And during those talks, it became very clear that it was those folks believed that her boyfriend had killed her.
Right.
For the record, Bob Durst was never Susan Berman's boyfriend, was he?
No, listen. From what you told me.
And from what you observed in that, I think that the time you met, clearly they weren't boyfriend and girl.
No, we were very close friends.
Right. Let's turn to the New York Times and Mr. Bagley. You testified yesterday that you had discussed your Susan conversation with Mr. Greenhouse.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Greenhouse is a dear friend of yours
Yes.
who was and is retired author of the New York Times. He was very well respected in his writing, his columns, and he's also a lawyer. True?
Yes.
You had discussions with him about this Susan conversation multiple times over the years, correct?
A few times, yes.
More than one.
More than one.
All right. And by the way, you never told Mr. Greenhouse that Susan mentioned Kathy's disappearance in that conversation, did you?
No.
These discussions that you had with Mr. Greenhouse, at least some of them were before you ever agreed to speak with Mr. Beck, correct?
Yes.
You then began to have a series of conversations with Mr. Beck, correct?
Yes.
It was only after the Jinx aired, the family gathering that you had where people were attempting to tell you details about the Jinx, that you agreed to let Mr. Bagley use your name, correct?
It was more that my mother had just passed.
I understand there's a lot more to it.
There was a lot to it.
I'm just getting at the timing.
Okay, yes,
That's pretty
yes.
much. It was after those events, your mother's passing, hearing about the Jinx, that you decided to let Mr. Bagley attribute your name to the story.
Yes.
Now, if I understand your testimony correctly, you chose to not share this information that you had for some 40 years with any law enforcement agencies, correct?
That's true.
Now, this is despite your very dear friend and confidant, Mr. Greenhouse, telling you that you should, correct?
Yes.
You have stated that he urged you originally to go to law enforcement, correct?
Yes, he gave me two options. He would go to law enforcement and go to the press.
And you're an educated and seem to be very intelligent lady. Do you agree with me?
I think so.
I think you are too. As such, surely you at least crossed your mind that you could seek confidentiality or anonymity either with the press or law enforcement, true?
No, I didn't.
Never crossed your mind.
That I would get anonymity, no.
You never confided in anyone in law enforcement and asked if you could make a confidential report then?
No, I didn't.
You never considered sending an anonymous letter to the authorities?
No.
Now, relative to your decision to never disclose this to law enforcement prior to Mr. Bagley, even Mr. Lewin voiced his displeasure with your decision, didn't he?
Yeah.
And you testified in a number of ways yesterday that if you held this conversation out of public view, the press or law enforcement, let's say, for over 40 years because of concerns for your safety.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not at that time. I didn't. It was more after Susan died.
Well, let's just say instead of 40 years, 15 years. Is that fair?
Yes.
And you were so concerned about your safety, Ms. Barnes, that you chose to disclose your identity to the most venerable paper in the entire world. Is that right?
I wouldn't call it venerable, but...
It's pretty well read, isn't it?
Yes, it is. At that point, I had just said fun, but I didn't realize the consequences. I really was not aware of the consequences.
Thank you very much for your time this morning. You are out of class.
Bailey, your direct examination.
Thank you.
that for another time.
Good morning again. Would you say you're a person who's really good with dates or not so good with dates?
Dates?
Yeah.
No.
And not so good?
Being an artist, numbers were never my favorite.
Okay. Notwithstanding your issues with dates in particular, how certain are you that the conversations that we're talking about with Susan happened at the same point in time when Kathleen's disappearance had become a big deal in the media?
I didn't know about Kathy's disappearance when Susan first told me, but after that it was in the paper.
But I guess I asked a little bit of a vague question. How certain are you that this conversation occurred in the same week that it became a big story?
I'm very certain. Positive.
I'm going to play a clip from you, interview 1, page 8, line 12 through 23. Please listen to this. 12 through 23. First interview.
You were starting to tell us, Miriam, you said you had a conversation with Susan a day or two after Kathy disappeared. Go ahead.
And she said, what John said, you know? She asked me to come up, and she said she did something, and she said, well, you know, if something happened to me, I did.
So she said she did something.
Yeah.
Do you recall those statements?
Yes.
You made those statements to us during the first time we spoke with you, is that right?
I guess the first time, I don't know whether it was the morning or the night.
Okay.
Are you marking this?
People spoke.
Thank you.
And the audio.
Transcript of, what's that in, specifically transcript of interview with?
Interview with Miriam Barnes, December 27th, 2016, page 8, lines 12 through 23. Morning interview. Did Mr. Lewin tell you what to say when you were relating to us what occurred?
No.
Were you relating to us, to the best of your ability, what you knew from your own mind because you were the one there who experienced it?
Yes.
Okay. You said you had an opportunity to read, at some point, Mr. Bagley's article, is that right?
That morning, he emailed it to me.
7-page document, remember, as People's 13? So, remember?
Yeah.
Do you recall, did you tell Mr. Bagley that Ms. Berman during this conversation was very nervous and very sad?
Yes.
Did you tell Mr. Bagley that Susan had told you, Bobby asked me to do something and I did it?
Yes.
Did you tell Mr. Bagley that Susan said, if anything happens to me, just remember Bobby did it?
Yes.
Did you tell Mr. Badley these things before you had ever met Mr. Lewin?
Yes.
Did you tell Mr. Badley these things before you had ever met me?
Yes.
Did you tell Mr. Badley these things before you had ever met Detective Camacho or Detective Shanley or any other LAPD police officer on this case?
Yes.
Why did you tell Mr. Badley these things before you met us? Why did you tell him these things?
I don't have a great answer for that. I know that my friend said that I had to step up and for my friend, and he said I could trust Charlie Bagley, and
were you making any things up?
no.
Okay. Did you express your fear to Mr. Greenhouse?
Yes.
Did you express your fear to Mr. Greenhouse on more than one occasion?
Yes.
Did you express your fear to Mr. Greenhouse before you met Mr. Lewin?
Yes.
Did you express your fear to Mr. Greenhouse before you met me or any other LAPD officer on this case?
Yes.
Were you afraid after Susan's funeral when you realized what in your mind you believed Robert Durst had done to your friend?
Yes.
I believe you testified that you were petrified, is that correct?
Yes.
And you were petrified before you met us?
Yes.
Were you petrified when you learned and believed in your mind that this defendant, Mr. Robert Durst, had chopped a man into pieces in Texas?
Yes.
And were you petrified of that before you met Mr. Lewin or myself or any other LAPD officer?
Yes.
Did anything that we did or said cause you to be more afraid than you already were?
Yes.
How so?
Just the fact that I was involved, and I tried to not use Bobby's name when I spoke to you. I was editing myself because I was scared.
So is it our involvement made you more afraid because we caused you to become a part of this process?
Yes.
I guess what I'm asking is, did we say things to make you more afraid than you were?
No, it just was the fact that I was being brought into this that frightened me.
Do you want to be here right now?
No.
When we told you you were going to have to come out here and testify, what was your response?
No, I don't want to come.
Did we explain to you the subpoena power of the court and how we could really make you come here?
Yes.
Did you tape these calls that the defense has been playing?
Me?
Yeah.
No.
Who taped them?
I can shoot it.
Okay. I think you said yesterday, how many times have you been married?
Once.
I believe on cross-examining, Mr. Lewis was asking you some questions about what you've previously said and what you've expressed at different times about whether you knew or believed what Susan Berman did was a good or a bad thing.
Right.
Let me ask you this. When Susan Berman told you, Bobby asked me to do something today and I did it. If something happens to me, just remember Bobby did it. Did that sound to you like it's been a good thing or a bad thing?
Didn't sound like a good thing.
Do you have a motion?
Yeah.
Mr. Lewis asked you some questions and showed you some slides about conversations you had with us regarding speaking with the defense investigator.
Yes.
Did we tell you it was your decision whether you should or shouldn't speak with the defense?
Yes.
And did you make your own personal decision?
Yes.
And what was your decision?
But I didn't want to.
I have nothing further to say.
Very briefly on this, Mr. Lewis, thank you.
So you were sure to tell? Sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
Do you want to?
May I real quick?
That might be better if he goes first. Unending series of examinations. Okay. Yeah.
I had read you an excerpt from People's 13. I just never asked you. Is that the same thing you had read in the New York Times?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, thank you. All right, Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Your Honor. People are going to help.
You were sure to tell us, Miriam, you said you had a conversation with Susan a day or two after Kathy disappeared. Go ahead.
She said what John said, you know. She asked me to come up. And she said she did something. And she said, I want you to know that if something happens to me, I did.
So she said she did something.
Yeah.
Ms. Barnes, I want to focus on line 15 there, Mr. Lewis stated. A day or two after Kathy disappeared. Go ahead. See that?
Yeah.
So again, those are Mr. Lewis' words about a day or two after Kathy disappeared, not yours. Correct? Those are Mr. Lewis' words, aren't they?
Yes.
This is a 12, is it a 12-8? 12.
I'm going to try to do this expeditiously, Ms. Barnes. Would you be surprised to learn in neither call 1 or call 2 on December 27th you ever mentioned having a conversation within days of Kathy disappearing? Not 1 day, not 2 days, not a couple of weeks. Nowhere. Does it surprise you?
I don't know what you're trying to...
What I'm trying to say is line 15 is Mr. Lewis' word, a day or two after Kathy disappeared.
Right, because as I said yesterday, I didn't know the timeline.
Understood. You never said a day or two, you never said a week, you didn't say anything like that.
No.
Those are Mr. Lewis' words, right?
Yes.
You've seen Mr. Bagley here in the courtroom.
For the first time yesterday, yes.
Did you speak to it?
Hello. Nice to meet you.
Finally met him in person.
Yeah.
Your Honor, lastly, to make sure I believe, Robin, this is 5 O's, Your Honor. Oh, 4 page. Thank you again, Mr. Barnes.
Any additional questions, Mr. Bailey?
Oh, yes.
Thank you, ma'am.
Can you put that? And the
Appreciate this exhibit.
people with father.
You were sure to tell us, Miriam, you said you had a conversation with Susan a day or two after Kathy disappeared. Go ahead.
She said what John said, you know. She asked me to come up. And she said she did something. And she said, I want you to know that if something happens to me, I did.
So she said she did something.
Yeah.
Mary, this is people's quote. People's quote. So Mr. Lewis was just asking you questions referring to Mr. Lewin saying a day or two after Kathy disappeared, go ahead, suggesting that those were Mr. Lewin's words, not yours. Do you recall those questions just now?
Yes.
Okay. I would like to just back up to the page before this, down to the 021, page 7, lines 21 to 25. May I mark this as People's 14?
Is it the same document?
Oh.
You marked the whole interview? Or you marked it page by page of an audio?
We were doing an audio clip last hearing. Each audio clip was separate.
Okay.
Oh.
Thank you. Okay, 14 and 14.
I'd like you to listen to this.
It's page 7, lines 21 through 25.
Do you remember, Miriam, when that took place in reference to when Kathy disappeared?
A day or two.
What day or two before, after?
Okay. Whose words were those?
Those were mine.
Did Mr. Lewin suggest to you that it was a day or two? Or were those your words?
Those were mine.
Did Mr. Lewin suggest to you that it was after? Or were those your words?
Those are my words, I said.
And this part of the conversation occurred before the clip Mr. Lewis just played where Mr. Lewin said a day or two after.
Now I know. I know which one came first and which one came second.
Now you know?
Now I know.
I'm glad we know. Thank you.
Shall I excuse me?
No objection, Your Honor.
You're excused, Ms. Barnes.
Exhibits, Mr. Henderson?
Your Honor, we've completed testimony of Miriam Barnes. That was 76. I have in my hand a 2-page document. This is a sheet that references the 5 exhibits played in the video with new exhibit numbers for trial. People 76C is a 1-page photograph. In the video, it was People's 11. People 76D is a 1-page transcript. In the video, it was People's 12A. People 76E is a 7-page article. In the video, it was People's 13. People's 76F is a 1-page transcript. In the video, it was People's 14A. And finally, People's 76G is 4 pages of slides. In the video, it was defense 5 O's. We ask these exhibits be marked for identification.
Mark. Well, I think we could take our morning recess. It's about 10:20, so until 10:35, ladies and gentlemen, we will recess. Do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with the case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case. Thank you. Are you guys texting each other? Are you texting each other as you? So, all right, People versus Robert Durst. He's present with Mr. Lewis, Mr. DeGuerin, and Mr. Chesnoff. We have Mr. Lewin at council table with Mr. Henderson. You're calling a witness?
Yes, Your Honor. First, we have a stipulation.
You may read it.
Thank you. On or about December 26, 2016, Miriam Barnes gave permission for Charles Bagley, then a reporter for the New York Times, to publish the information that she had previously provided to him in prior interviews. As a result of that permission, the following excerpt of Ms. Barnes' statement to Mr. Bagley was printed in the New York Times on December 26, 2016. For one moment. Might have had a typo on that. I apologize, Your Honor. No, I just want to make sure that I'm...
Thank you.
Got that right. No, that is correct.
We have one more.
Yes.
Continuing, Your Honor?
Yes.
As a result of that permission, the following excerpt of Ms. Berman's statement to Mr. Bagley was printed in the New York Times on December 26, 2016. The excerpt reads as follows. Miriam Barnes, a friend of Ms. Berman's who lived next door on Beekman Place in Manhattan, has her own vivid memory of Ms. Berman at the time. Ms. Durst vanished. Unlike many of Ms. Berman's other friends, she has not been interviewed by investigators from New York or Los Angeles. One afternoon, she cannot recall the exact date after nearly 35 years, Ms. Berman returned to her apartment building after work and immediately sought her out, Ms. Barnes said. Ms. Berman was both, quote, very nervous and sad, unquote. They sat face to face in chairs in the hallway of Ms. Berman's apartment as Ms. Berman leaned forward. Quote, she said, Bobby asked me to do something and I did it, unquote, Ms. Barnes said. If anything happens to me, just remember Bobby did it, unquote. Ms. Berman never explained her cryptic comment, Ms. Barnes said, but it stuck with her nonetheless. So stipulated?
So stipulated.
Court accept the stipulation, Your Honor?
Court does. You're marking this?
I think what we'll do is, Your Honor, we'll put this in a more formal stipulation.
Yes. All right. And ladies and gentlemen, you understand that stipulated facts are not at issue. You must accept them as true. Are you okay with the juror number 10? You're okay with that seat? Or you can scoot over if you like. If that's okay with juror number 12, it's okay. If that's okay with juror number 12, you're actually within. All right. Looks okay. We're maintaining our distance just for everyone's sake until we're instructed otherwise. So we wait to hear from the presiding judge on that. I know the governor has announced there will be some changes. The court's probably a little bit behind the governor, but we will we'll let you know if we can make adjustments in our seating as soon as that's possible. So next, you intend to call another witness?
Yes, Your Honor. People call Stephen Greenhouse.
Raise your right hand to be sworn. Do solemnly state that the testimony you may give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Be seated. Please state and spell your first and last name.
Stephen Greenhouse, S-T-E-V Victor E-N, Greenhouse, Greenhouse.
Mr. Greenhouse, you are off to an auspicious start. Without question, you have the loudest voice coming over the microphone with no instructions whatsoever. You should teach our other witnesses.
My mother always called me a big mouth.
First of all, how do you feel about being in court today?
As someone who went to law school, who has watched many trials on TV and police shows on TV, it's an honor and a little nervous-inducing to take the stand for the first time in my life.
So if there's any questions that I ask you or Mr. Lewis asks you don't understand, just let the judge know. Start with an easy one. Where do you live? And I'm not talking about the exact address.
I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
And that's in New York, is that correct?
Yes, that's in New York.
And you're out here just to testify at trial, is that correct?
That's correct.
What do you do for a living?
I was a reporter with the New York Times for 31 years. In 2014, the company offered a buyout equivalent to 2 years' pay. I was age 63, and I took the buyout and retired. And since then, I wrote a book, and I've been doing a lot of freelance writing.
And what did you do specifically for the New York Times?
So I started there in 1983, originally as a business reporter, writing about the steel industry and other basic industries. Then I was the Chicago Midwestern business correspondent for 3 years. Then I served in the Paris Bureau in France as the European economics correspondent for 5 years. I covered the downfall of communism in Eastern Europe. Then I was transferred to Washington for 4 years, where I covered economics for 2 years and diplomacy in the State Department for 2 years. And then I went back to New York and covered the labor movement, worker issues for 19 years. That took me all over the country, often took me to LA to write stories too.
And what is your educational background?
I grew up in Massapequa, South Shore of Long Island, went to high school there, same town as Alec Baldwin and Jerry Seinfeld.
You might, I'm not sure, the court reporter might know how to spell it. I don't. She might appreciate a spelling on that.
We often call it matzo pizza. I'm not supposed to say that. Massapequa, M. Michael A. S. Sam S. Sam A. P. P.
Wait. You know, saying the name doesn't really help that much. Just say the letters.
Okay, sorry. M. A. S. S. A. P. Peter E. Q. U. A. Massapequa. It's an old Native American name, but they joke matzo pizza. Anyway, so then I went to college in Connecticut, a college called Wesleyan in Middletown, Connecticut, and I got a master's degree in journalism at Columbia University. And then I worked in newspapers for a while, and I went to NYU Law School. I graduated in 1982. I was class valedictorian. I clerked for a federal judge after that.
And did you ever work as a lawyer?
I only as a law clerk. Then I clerked for a federal judge, Robert Carter, who was pretty well known. I clerked several summers at various law firms, but I was offered a job by the New York Times during my years as a law clerk. I always dreamt of working at the New York Times, and I took a job as a reporter there. My law professor was very disappointed, but they said you have a year or two to come back. Sorry. Okay, so an editor I knew at the New York Times offered me a job while I was in my clerkship, and I always was interested, dreamt of working at the New York Times. And my law professors were disappointed that I was leaving that field, and they said, you could always change your mind and come back. But I loved being a journalist.
And you indicated you retired in 2014?
I retired in 2014. Two of my very best friends had just died of cancer. They were also 63 at the time. And I thought, I've been a workaholic at the New York Times for 31 years. Let me get off this, this carousel and try to relax a while. Plus, I had a book contract that I had to fulfill. So,
When I say the name Miriam Barnes, is that a name you recognize?
yes,
Can you describe your relationship with her?
yes. So my mother, who grew up in the Bronx, was best friends of a woman, of Miriam Barnes' mother. And they were, friends since second, third grade. They used to tell me about, going out together after school. So I grew up on Long Island. Miriam Barnes grew up in Queens. Our families were good friends. I might see her every 4 months or every 6 months. We weren't that close, but we were friends. And it was mainly just family friends. We were never very close personal friends, but we liked each other.
Did you stay in touch over the years as you became adults?
Yes, we did. We'd see each other every 6 months. She lived in California for a while, and I was on the East Coast. I was in Paris. So we were less in touch when she was in California.
When I say the name Charlie Bagley, is that a name you recognize?
Yes, it is.
And can you describe how you know Mr. Bagley?
So Charlie was a reporter at the New York Times for many of the years I was. I was working for the Metro desk for a while as the labor reporter. Charlie covered real estate issues for the Metro desk as a labor reporter. We sat several desks away from each other. Sometimes you'd have lunch with different people. Sometimes I'd have lunch with Charlie or other people, and we weren't especially close, but we were friends the way you're friends with many colleagues at work.
When I say the name Robert Durst, is that a name that you recognize?
Yes.
And how do you recognize that name?
So, around 20 years ago, I received a phone call at home one night after work from Miriam Barnes. And she said, Stephen...
Well, wait, I just want to...
Okay, so that was the first time I really heard of Robert Durst. I covered labor for the New York Times. There were often disputes with the real estate industry. The janitors, the doormen were considering a strike. And I'd often write about the main real estate owners group in New York City. And the Durst family was one of those families. And Seymour Durst was the name, I think that was the father, that everybody knew. He was a famous man in New York. I'd never heard of Robert Durst.
And you've answered this question to some degree, but when I say the name Susan Berman, is that a name that you knew prior to being contacted by Miriam Barnes?
Not at all.
So I want to ask you now, were you contacted by Miriam Barnes? And can you describe the contact, when it occurred, and what it involved?
Yes. So aside from occasional friendly contacts every 6 months or so, I received a phone call one evening about 20 years ago from Miriam Barnes, and she said, Stephen, crazy sad thing happened. My friend Susan Berman was murdered. She said she was a close friend. And she said, Stephen, I want your advice on this. You're a good friend, you're a lawyer, you're a journalist, you have an idea of how the world works. She said, Susan told me if anything happens to me, it would be Bobby Durst. And at the time, I had no idea in the world who Bobby Durst was. I had no idea in the world who Susan Berman was. And Miriam was asking me my advice as to whether she should go to the police or go to the press.
And what did you tell her in response to that?
So, again, I knew nothing about Robert Durst. I knew nothing about Susan Berman. My friend Miriam told me she was scared that if she went to the police, maybe the same thing would happen to her that happened to Susan Berman. So I realized, and I said, look, we're friends. I don't want you to do anything that you think would endanger you. I had no idea whether, there might be, something might happen to her if she went to the police. But I honored her wishes and said, look, if you're scared, it's not worth it. There's not a legal obligation to go to the police. And she was clearly scared that something might happen to her.
Let me ask you, during the conversation, do you recall if Miriam mentioned anything about Susan having told her that she had done something for Bobby?
My memory is that Miriam had told me that Susan had explained that Susan knew something or did something that that Bobby Durst was worried that Susan might, tell the authorities about.
And at the time that Miriam Barnes came to you, was it your perspective that she was coming to you in your position as a reporter, as a lawyer, or as her friend?
I think mainly just as a friend, but I think she appreciated that, I had a sense of the law and how that worked, and a sense of how journalism works, and I think she trusted me as an ethical, good sense person. I know that sounds a little conceited, but I think, we've known each other for years, we trusted each other, we respected each other's opinions.
Do you recall, and this is approximately, you said about 20 years ago was when she came to you, is that correct?
Yes.
And at the time that she came to you, did she reference coming to you in connection with Susan Berman's death?
Yes. I mean, again, I knew nothing about Susan Berman. I knew nothing about Bobby Durst. And, she called me and said, I have this crazy story. A friend of mine was murdered. Susan Berman was murdered. I knew that Miriam was out here in California, working as an artist. And she told me that Susan had been one of her good friends.
And I want to ask you, when she told you this, did she indicate to you how recent the murder had been? In other words, was it something that had happened close in time, years ago? What did she tell you?
I think it was very close in time. I think it was just a few days earlier.
And did you have any contact with Miriam Barnes regarding this issue, again, prior to the television show The Jinx airing in 2015?
I occasionally was in touch with Miriam, but I don't think we really discussed it for many years until I visited her mother. Her mother was dying, and my wife and I went out to Queens to visit her mother, who was very ill, and that, by total coincidence, was just when The Jinx was showing.
And did you have any conversations with Miriam Barnes at or near the time that The Jinx showed?
Yes.
And during that time, did you encourage her to come forward with what she knew?
Around that time, Mr. Durst was arrested, and my memory wasn't, we didn't have much conversation about that. She was still somewhat scared. She had told me she was worried about going forward. She told me this more after her mother died than before her mother died. After her mother died, she was more willing to come forward because she was so worried. She was very much the caretaker for her mother, and she was worried if she came forward and something happened to her, that would make it very hard. That would leave no one to take care of her mother.
With respect to this point in time, did you encourage her to speak to Charlie Bagley?
After The Jinx and some of the revelations in that show, it just so happened there was a retirement party for me at the New York Times, and Charlie was there, and Miriam was there, and they met each other, and I said, maybe Miriam, you want to talk sometime to Charlie, and Charlie's a very good, honest reporter, and he will respect, your wishes about what you're willing to say privately and what you're willing to say publicly.
Did Miriam later relate to you that she had spoken with Charlie Bagley about the information involving Susan Berman?
Yes.
And at some point, did you learn that not only had Miriam spoken to Charlie, but that sometime later she had authorized him to print the story?
Yes. She was initially scared about going public, and I told her you could speak to Charlie on background, meaning he wouldn't use your name. And I guess in this, at some point she and Charlie developed a rapport, or maybe it was after her mother died. Or maybe it was after Mr. Durst was arrested. She felt more emboldened to go public.
Did she ever explain to you why she had finally told Charlie Bagley that she would go on the record?
It was, my memory is it was a combination of those factors. She was very very reluctant to go forward while her mother was still alive because she was worried something might happen to her. The fact that Mr. Durst was then behind bars made her less scared to go forward. And I think also she saw, she came to trust Charlie Bagley and thought that, I guess she thought that Bobby Durst had killed Susan, and I guess she wanted justice done in the case. And I'm just speculating now about her motives, but I think she wanted to help ensure that justice would be done.
Let me ask you, if I were to ask you the question, would you describe Miriam Barnes as a credible or a not credible person?
I would judge the relevance of this witness's position.
Improper bolstering. Your Honor, it's admissible. They have.
Okay,
I think she's a very trustworthy, honest person.
And if I were to ask you, given what you know about Miriam Barnes and about this situation, if I were to ask you in any way, based on your experience and your observation, is Miriam Barnes the kind of person who appears to be looking for her 15 minutes of fame?
Just the opposite, I would say. If she were looking for her 15 minutes of fame, when she called me 20 years ago, she could have gone to the press and said, Susan Berman told me this, and that would have been the headlines of many papers, but she was very quiet about it. And another thing, so her job in Hollywood was a graphic artist for various films, including Ninja Turtles. And at some point she said, I want to do something more meaningful with my life. And she studied to be a social worker. She moved back to New York. She worked in halfway houses for people with drug problems, with mental problems. And if she wanted her 15 minutes of fame, that was not a way to pursue it. She really wanted to do good with her life. Not to say working for Hollywood isn't doing good. So.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Greenhouse.
Good morning.
I hope to make this relatively painless and quick. I want to talk about the chronology for one moment. Your friendship, obviously, with Miss Barnes goes back many decades. You have to answer audibly for the court report.
Yes.
Thank you. Based on y'all's long-term relationship, bless you, you're aware that Miriam Barnes was previously married?
Yes.
And she was married in 1978, is that correct?
I am not sure, sir.
Does that sound about right in the chronology of
It
things?
sounds about right.
So let me follow up on that. The conversation that Miriam Barnes reported to you, that being the conversation at issue here with Susan Berman, it is your understanding that took place before she was married, correct?
I do not know, sir.
Would you have any reason to distrust Miss Barnes, given your opinion of her, if she said her conversation with Miss Berman took place before she was married?
My sense was the conversation was closer to the time of the murder rather than further from the time of the murder.
Understood. And if it's in asking you about your opinion of her credibility, if Miss Barnes' recollection is that conversation happened before she got married, you wouldn't doubt that, would you?
I wouldn't doubt that. I trust her and what she says.
Thank you very much. Pass the witness, Your Honor.
May this witness be excused? Yes, Your Honor.
Nothing affirmative, you are excused.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I spoke too fast.
Thank you. Have a good day.
People may call the next witness.
People's next witness is a conditional examination video.
Yes?
Testimony of Stephen Silverman.
Yes.
It should take us to the lunch break.
Okay.
Ask that the DVD be marked as People 77, transcript as People 77A.
So is the screen, do you need to relocate that screen, Mr. Henderson?
Yes, thank you.
do have one. I already started marking mine now, or I'd give it up.
No.
Thank you.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly state that the testimony you're about to give in the past confidence before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please be seated. Please state and spell your first and last name.
Stephen, S-T-E-T-H-E-N. Silverman, S-I-L-V-E-R-M-A-N.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Silver.
Good afternoon.
Are you nervous or no?
Well, I'm a writer. I'm not used to speaking, so. Yes.
Have you ever testified in court before?
In court now.
Can you tell me, I'll start off with the easy ones. How old are you?
65.
And your education?
I have a master's degree from Columbia University.
In what area?
Journalism.
And what are you currently, are you still working or are you retired?
Well, I'm an author. For 20 years, I was an editor at Time Incorporated.
And are you, when you say you're retired, are you still on?
Well, no, I'm still writing. I have a book contract. I do travel pieces for the Chicago Tribune, but I'm not working at the pace of during younger career.
And when you said you were an editor, what did you do during your career as an editor? You said for Time.
For Time Inc., I helped establish People Magazine's website. I've also been a journalism professor at Columbia University for 9 years. I've written 12 books.
And when I say the name Susan Berman, is that somebody's name you've heard of?
Yes.
And how do you know Susan Berman?
When I was a very young editor, fresh out of grad school, I edited a magazine in Los Angeles. One day, out of the blue, Susan arrived in my office, introduced herself. She did not really need an introduction because she'd written a story for a San Francisco publication that got national attention. And she wanted to write for my magazine, but I assured her it wasn't a good fit.
Well, what was your magazine?
It was called Coast. It was a regional monthly. It was one of the few titles going out here, except for Los Angeles. Los Angeles Magazine.
And so Susan came to you and she basically said you wanted to write.
She introduced herself. I'd never met anyone like her. She spoke a mile a minute. I got her whole life story, I would say, in 2 minutes.
Do you remember about what year this would have been?
It more than likely was 1976.
And can you explain, that was not your last interaction?
Oh, no. So, a few months after that, we were both at the, there was a book convention, the National Book Convention. And it was in San Francisco, and she was there. And I think I said to her, I'm thinking of moving to New York. And I don't know if she was living in New York yet, or whether she was still living in San Francisco. And then the following year, or months later, she called and said there was an apartment next to hers in New York, and she wanted me to take it. Susan never, she would tell you what to do.
Well, so at some point,
I did take it.
so you moved from LA to New York?
I did.
That would seem to not be a really convenient apartment for you if you were still living out here.
Yeah. I had several job prospects, very good job prospects, and I moved to New York, and I soon got a job.
And do you know about what year this was?
Oh, I know exactly. It was 1977, in the fall.
And when you said that she had an apartment that she wanted you to take, do you remember where that was?
Oh, I do. It was, she lived at number 34 Beekman Place, and this was in number 32. These were tiny, tiny apartments on really one of the most exclusive streets in Manhattan.
And so you ended up taking that apartment?
I did.
And is it fair to say that living next door to Susan, with the two of you had continued interactions after that?
We palled around, and we were both, in the same field. So
What's the age difference between you and Susan approximately?
I think she was born in 1945. I think she's 6 years older than I.
And would you say that during the time you lived next door, how close did the two of you get?
Well, we were very close. And she would call me 10 o'clock at night to say that New York Magazine wants her to interview. I'm talking fast because she always did. Stephen, New York Magazine, I won't. All right.
For our reporters.
Okay, I know, I'm sorry. Stephen, Huntington Hartford, New York Magazine wants me to interview Huntington Hartford. Huntington Hartford was the A&P heir. And he lives at #1 Beekman Place. But Stephen, I hear he's a lech. You have to come with me. And at 10 o'clock at night, I would go with her. And that was quite an experience. She only had a shower in her tiny apartment. I had a bathtub. Susan would show up in her crazy kimono. She'd give me a phone call first, but she'd come over and use my bathtub. And, she'd take me along when she was meeting new people. We were both expanding our circles at the time. But also, I think she wanted a sidekick.
How well did you get to know her during that period?
Very well.
And if I were to ask you to describe, what was Susan's personality like? How would you describe it?
It was many things, not all of them flattering. She was very abrasive. First, when she introduced herself to me, she first said, my father was a gangster. He helped Bugsy Siegel build the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. And, I would see Susan in action. One night, she got a phone call. Susan had a ring that had belonged to her uncle, Chicky. Susan had an uncle named Chicky. And
but by the way, because I know this will come up later, any idea how you would spell Uncle Chicky?
I would spell it Chickkie.
Thank you.
This relative, it could even have been a daughter of Uncle Chicky, wanted the ring, and Susan, it was World War III on the phone, and she turned on a dime. And one of the things I vividly remember her saying was, I'm the daughter of a gangster, and don't forget it.
Well, did Susan appear when she would talk about her father's gangsterism? Was it something that she talked about and cried?
Yeah, well, she knew it was colorful, and we didn't want to hear it. Susan loved attention.
If I were to ask you, Mr. Silverman, obviously you had a lot of friends in your lifetime, correct? No, you got the court reporter just to get...
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I was thinking about some of them. You can have them.
One other thought is that you might pause before you answer the question.
I'm sorry.
You are overrunning the question because you already know your answer, and that, again, is hard for
I'm sorry.
a reporter, even now. Go ahead.
I assume you had some friends that are lower maintenance, some friends that are higher maintenance. Where would Susan have been on the low, high maintenance scale? Let's say 1 to 100, 1 being, wow, this is the lowest maintenance friend I have, and 100 being, boy, she is the most high maintenance person I've come across.
Susan would score a perfect 100.
And did that make it somewhat difficult for you to live so close to her?
It was very difficult living so close to her. I only kept that apartment 1.5 years.
And you said that Susan was high maintenance. Was she also something on the other side that you would describe as a loyal friend?
Yes, that she was.
And what makes you say that? Why do you have to change when you got your reputation?
Once you were in her circle, you were trapped. You could not escape if you wanted to. Because it sort of helped her image to know all these people. But by the same token, Susan was the sort of person who, as soon as a person would leave a room, she had her nose fixed, or he's on coke, or he's gay. You always knew never to leave the room. If Susan was still there.
Did you also deal with Susan on a professional basis as well?
I did.
And can you describe what
Yeah.
kind of interaction you had?
She became an editor at Us magazine. And I did a piece for her on the actress Jill Clayburgh. Because I was hired, I was the chief entertainment writer for the New York Post. So I was encountering everyone, including celebrities Us magazine could not gain access to. And Susan asked me to, you know, take whatever I didn't use in the Post and do up a profile. I mean, that was, you know, Susan was clever that way. Jill Clayburgh was not happy with the piece, but you know, we would travel. Once she got that job, we'd end up at the same press parties. I would
Would you describe Susan as an intelligent person?
I would.
And how intelligent?
Susan was extremely shrewd.
What do you mean by that?
I don't know how to put it any better than to say she could see all the angles to something.
When I say the term focus, and I say the name Susan Berman, is there a connection between those two words, Susan Berman and phobia?
Yes, when you would go to a restaurant with her, the waiter would no sooner say his name than she would list every allergy she had. And she couldn't go in, she couldn't do elevations, which is why when I moved away, I moved to the 24th floor.
And that was because you knew that if you were at a high floor,
I was safe.
meaning
Yeah,
she would not come over.
she wouldn't visit.
How was she in terms of her perspective about her personal security?
Oh, she had 3 locks on her door.
So is Susan, in your experience, is Susan the kind of person that would, you know, someone knocks on the door and she's going to open the door without knowing who it is?
No.
And if I were to ask you, kind of, and I'm going to go stereotypes, you kind of have your, you know, Midwestern person from Kansas, they don't lock the doors. Then on the other extreme, you have your paranoid New Yorker with 27 locks on the door, etc. Where does Susan kind of fit in that?
Well, she did not have 27 locks, but she had several. And we had a buzzer. This was on Beacon Place. And she would answer. She was also on the ground floor. I mean, there were bars on the window, but, you know, she was in closer proximity to the street.
In Beekman, you're talking about Beekman.
On Beacon Place.
That was a very, that was not a high crime neighborhood, correct?
No. The Shaw Moran's sister lived across the street.
I want you to assume the following fact, Mr. Silverman. I want you to assume that Susan Berman is inside her residence. It is after 10:30 p.m. at night. Based on your experience, if someone had come to Susan's door after 10:30 p.m. at night, I'm talking about where her residence, would she have opened the door to somebody she did not know?
Oh, no, Susan would not let a stranger into her house. She wouldn't even speak to a stranger at a party.
And if I were to ask you, how sure are you of that? Is that something you could feel just not very strong about, or are you saying, no, there's no way?
There's no way.
Was Susan a manipulative person?
Extremely.
And can you explain why you gave that answer?
If one way or another, Susan would get whatever it was she wanted. You know, if she might start out politely, but then she would really start threatening you or telling you, I did this for you, I did that for you.
And is this
Susan, never took no for an answer.
And is this personal experience that you've had with her?
Yes.
If I would ask you, how persistent a person was Susan?
Extremely.
You mentioned that Susan had a large circle of friends. Is that correct?
Correct.
Did you and Susan have any friends in common?
A few, one in particular.
Who were the friends you had in common?
Her name was Hillary Johnson. She went to Columbia with me. She too was a journalist. And I introduced the two of them, and they became very close.
Did you interact with any of Susan's other friends?
Susan would have people over, or we would meet at dinners. Yes.
Where if I say the name Nick Chapin, is that something you do?
It's a very familiar sounding name. Other than that, I don't recall much.
What about the name Robert Durst?
Yes, well, I remember him.
And how do you remember the name Mr. Durst?
He was Susan's pal. And we would go to, we were at dinners and things.
What did you know about the relationship between Susan and Robert Durst?
Simply that they went to school together and they were very close.
And if I were to ask you, in terms of the people that Susan talked about, that she was close to, where did Mr. Durst rank on that scale based on your conversations with Susan?
He was a high priority and a very close friend.
Did you ever meet Robert Durst yourself?
Back then, yeah.
And
Yes.
back then, are we talking about?
40 years ago.
And when you say 40 years ago, do you mean
Starting in...
when you say 40 years ago, do you mean during the time that you and Susan were living in New York?
On Bigwin Place, yes.
By the way, do you see Robert Durst in the courtroom today?
I do.
Can you please indicate where he's located, where he's wearing?
The gentleman with the earphone.
Mr. Durst?
Can you tell me, prior to meeting Robert Durst, prior to meeting, had you heard about him?
In all likelihood, yes.
And what would Susan say about Robert Durst?
That she was very close to Bobby, and she wished to impress upon me, I felt, that his family owned Times Square, which at the time we didn't have Google back then. And I didn't really know what she meant by that, but I know, she knew it connoted power.
And do you recall the circumstances where you mentioned that Robert Durst?
As best I recall, we would go to dinners. Neither Susan and I nor I cooked, so we would be going out to dinner, and it would be social encounters.
And do you recall if you also ran into Mr. Durst at a book party for Susan?
Yes, I attended Susan's book party at Sammy's restaurant, and Mr. Durst was on the dais with her.
And was that the party for her book, Mrs. Street?
Yes.
During the time that you had contact with Mr. Durst, can you describe what he was like?
He was generally very pleasant, and Susan and I, being journalists, sort of spoke in a shorthand, and he wasn't part of that, but it was pleasant.
Did the two of you run over each other?
Not like today. Sorry.
When you had your contact with Mr. Durst, did you also at some point meet a woman that was introduced to you as Kathy Durst, Mr. Durst's wife?
I was.
And did you actually see Robert Durst and Kathy Durst interact at all?
To some degree.
What was your impression of Kathy Durst when you saw her?
Again, a pleasant person. She was sort of, my image of her is she was in the background. It was sort of Susan who monopolized every situation. And then, if I may say Bobby, because that's what Susan called him, and that's how I think of him. And then Kathy was sort of standing behind Bobby.
Did you ever have any conversations with Kathy Durst yourself that you remember?
I really can't.
And to the best of your memory, did you and Bob Durst ever have any conversations that you recall?
A few, yes.
Anything looking back, no, that you remember?
No, he just always seemed interested in the fact that Susan and I were journalists.
And was there something in particular that you were being interested in about your journalistic career?
Well, I was everyone at that time, covering entertainment for the New York Post. I met every celebrity. And there was my byline with their picture. So people would ask me about celebrities all the time. It was a common.
And was that something you recall Mr. Durst doing as well?
I do.
If I were to ask you, was Susan protective of Bobby Durst?
Yes, she was.
And can you tell me what makes you say that?
But just her attitude. I mean, he was a point of pride in her list of friends.
Did you at some point become aware that Kathy Durst had disappeared?
I did.
Do you remember when that was?
Well, it was in the early 80s. And I remember reading about it in the New York Post.
So were you still in New York in the...
I was, and again, still working for the Post.
So is it fair to say that you found out that Kathy Durst disappeared at the time that it was publicized in the New York paper?
Correct.
Did you ever talk to Susan about Kathy's disappearance? Did she ever speak to you about it?
Sorry. No.
Did you ever ask her specifically about Kathy's disappearance?
No.
Now, you're a journalist at the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Say yes?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
You're working for People magazine.
Not yet.
Oh, you're working for the Post.
New York Post.
But you are their entertainment.
Correct.
Why didn't you ask her anything about her close friend's wife disappearing?
At the time, I was no longer close to Susan. I'd moved away and did my best to stay away. It never dawned on me to ask Susan, to be perfectly honest. Also, with Susan, no one talks. You listen to Susan. And, you know, what, she was going to tell me, a journalist?
Now, I asked you before, Mr. Silverman, if you would characterize Susan Berman as loyal to her close friends. Do you recall that?
Yes.
If I were to ask you, how loyal was Susan Berman to Bobby Durst, what would your answer be?
Extremely.
Are you aware, in terms of the people that you knew in her life, that you had interaction with, that she talked about, of anybody that she was closer to or more loyal to than Bobby Durst?
As best I know, no.
Knowing Susan Berman as you know her, is Susan the kind of person that could potentially manipulate somebody for money?
Well, yes.
And what leads you to that conclusion?
Well, she tried it with me. Not so much that I would write a check, but she called me up frantic, telling me I had to put her in touch with someone, a Broadway composer I had interviewed 15, 20 years before. She was desperate. She needed Easy Street to be turned into a Broadway musical. And it was a frantic phone message, but again, she reminded me, I got you your first apartment. It was, it was total Susan, but so frantic, I'd never heard her like that.
Did Susan have a habit that you discussed before about talking about bodily functions?
Yes, indeed.
And can you please describe what you mean by that?
She was a bit of a hypochondriac, but one morning she was sick and she didn't have a doctor. I took her to mine. And she then proceeded to give we call it blow-by-blow account of her impacted ballots. And Susan had an upset stomach. You heard about it in exact detail. And she did not hold back.
Was there a point in time, Mr. Silverman, where you heard that there had been a call placed to the dean of the medical school where Susan had, where the woman on the phone had discussed the symptoms she was having? This woman having identified himself as Kathy Durst. Have you heard this information before?
I have.
When you heard that information, what did you think?
A bell went off in my head.
At some point, you heard that there had been a call to allegedly, a call to the dean's office allegedly coming from Kathy Durst. Is that correct?
Correct.
And at some point, you heard that in this call that the individual discussed details about their sickness. Is that correct?
Correct. Graphic details.
And when you heard the report of what had been said on the phone, what is the first thing that went through your mind?
This sounds exactly like Susan.
Did Susan ever tell you yourself, did she ever say to you that she had knowledge about Catherine's disappearance?
No.
Now, given the relationship that you and Susan have, do you believe that that is the kind of thing that Susan would have confided in you about?
No.
And why is that?
Well, number one, I was a journalist. But number two, as I've said, she was very protective of her friends.
When you say you're a journalist, during the time period that you knew Susan, and when Kathy disappeared, you worked the entertainment beat of the Ghost, right?
Correct, but I had access to the city desk.
Right. And then you worked for People Magazine, correct?
Correct.
Let me ask something. Would that kind of information, I'm not saying whether you would have shared or not, but had you had that kind of information, would that have been something that you believe the periodicals that you worked for would have been interested in?
They would have been most interested.
Your memory of who you believe you heard that from?
Hillary Johnson.
By the way, given the relationship you have with Susan and how she talked about Bob Durst, is that comment consistent with the relationship that you observed Susan Berman and Bob Durst had?
That comment even has Susan's cadence. It sounds exactly like her.
At the time you first met Susan, can you tell me, where was she in terms of kind of the arc of her career? What I'm asking you was she successful? Was she struggling? When you first met her, where was she?
She had this big splash it was City Magazine in San Francisco. It was owned by Francis Ford Coppola. And she had a brilliant cover line. I believe it was even a photo of Susan on the cover. And it was Why Women Can't Get Laid in San Francisco. And she then wanted to establish a career in New York. That's where the center of the media was. She must have taken hundreds of copies of that issue. And she was trying to establish herself as a music writer. And through sheer persistence, she did a cover story for New York Magazine.
Let me ask something. Would it be fair to say then that early on in New York, when you knew Susan, the arc of her career was on the high side, up and coming, is that correct?
That is correct.
And did it continue to go up with the publication of Easy Street?
Well, Easy Street, I see as being her peak, but I think she sort of flubbed it. She was offered a lot of money for the movie rights. She kept telling me it was $1 million. I knew better because I was the entertainment writer for the Post. But Hollywood was interested, and she just kept saying, but Stephen, I can't just sell it to them. I have to write the screenplay myself. Well, I knew that wasn't going to happen either. And Susan may have just defeated herself.
So is it fair to say that over time, you can kind of follow the arc, where she's heading up, she ends up getting Easy Street, and then starting with Easy Street, is it fair to say that was the peak, and it was down from there?
Yes.
When you first met Susan, what was her financial situation as you observed it to be?
Well, she had all the right clothes, and she had all the right handbags. She was living in this tiny space on Beekman Place, but it was cute and a good address. Later on, I think that the money from Easy Street, she bought a condo on Beekman Place. So there was money. I never quite knew. There were always rumors Yeah, her father had left her all this money, but she didn't really live lavishly.
Well, I'm asking over time, was there a time when Susan ended up making you aware that she was having financial problems?
Oh, toward the end, she was in desperate straits.
So, did she complain to you about financial problems when you were with Susan?
No.
And you said there was at some point she did end up telling you that she was in desperate financial straits. Do you know when that was?
The early 90s.
Do you recall, did you have contact with her in the last year of her life?
I did.
And did you have contact with her approximately a month or two before she was murdered, where she was asking you for money?
Yes.
And to the best of your memory, what can you tell me about that?
Well, that was the incident I mentioned earlier, in which she insisted I put her in touch. There was the Broadway composer Cy Coleman. And first of all, I guess I could have just said politely, here's her book, maybe it's a good musical. But she was so frantic on the phone, I couldn't do that.
And I just want to make clear, Susan was involved in a musical based on the Dreyfus Affair. Is that the musical you're talking about?
No, it was a different one. She wanted him to adapt Easy Street. I saw the run-through of the Dreyfus Affair, and that never went anywhere. That was earlier.
Do you recall, let me ask you this way, do you have a better memory right now about the conversations you had with Susan years ago, or about specifically when those conversations took place?
It's all, I can't say it. I'm sorry. No, I mean, I can't pinpoint it. It's funny, the early years, yes, I can tell you because I knew where I was.
No, sir, if you listen to my question,
Sorry.
I'm asking you this. Do you have a better memory of what it was that Susan told you in these conversations, or a better memory of when those conversations?
Oh, I have a better memory of what she told me.
So you indicated that you believe you talked to her. How close to her murder?
Well, it was that year. I couldn't tell you exactly when.
In your experience, is Susan the kind of person who, in your experience, would overtly blackmail a friend? Overtly.
No, Susan was too clever to do anything overtly.
And can you tell me what you mean by that?
She would find other ways. She would hint that she had something on you. She pulled that on me.
Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, I just told her in conversation, my mother was in the city of Hope and very ill. And Susan called her and got the whole family history. I don't know why Susan was interested, but Susan made it clear to me she knew about my family.
There was an article that was printed in People magazine that was dated December 4th of 2000. Are you aware of this magazine article?
I have a vague memory of it.
Now, you were working for People Online at the time, is that correct?
Correct.
Did you actually read People magazine itself?
No.
Were they somewhat of a competitor?
No, not officially. There was a slight rivalry. We were a great fear to them because, as you know, online was replacing the print media.
And this was really the beginning of the online
Yes.
stuff, is that right?
Yes.
Did you have any involvement in the December 4th, 2000 article that came out in People magazine?
No.
How did you find out that Susan had been murdered?
It was my job as the editor of People Online to put the news together in the morning. So I would wake up at 5 a.m. and AP and UPI and Reuters were just beginning to put their stories the wires went on the computer. And I saw headlines that said Ryder murder. And it seemed that there had been an incident the week before, and I dismissed it at first. I thought there was why are they repeating this? And then there was a sub-headline on one of them. It said Susan Berman. And it was 4 in the morning. I read it. I got a knot in my stomach. And at 4 in the morning, you can't call anyone in New York. You can't call anyone in Los Angeles. And I just pushed back from the desk. I worked at home.
When you heard the news, at that time, did you make any connection to Robert Durst?
No.
Was the Susan Berman you knew, was she someone who, in your mind, was good at keeping important secrets?
Yes.
Have you ever described Susan as a blabber?
Yes, Susan would talk for the sake of talking. And anything could come out, but it would, fiction.
I mean, have you ever said that anyone who knew Susan would not, of their own volition, unless it were absolutely necessary, leave her with an important secret that could never be disclosed?
That would not be wise, yes.
Are you familiar with the movie All Good Things?
I am.
Did you actually, did you see the movie?
I did.
And what do you know about that movie?
Well, it's based on certain incidents.
Are you aware of the jinx?
I am.
Did you see the jinx?
I did.
Mr. Silverman, I've asked you questions about whether or not Susan Berman ever told you that she had information about Kathy Durst's disappearance. You recall those questions, correct?
I did.
As you sit here, are you aware that if you had such information, would you agree that that would likely be evidence that potentially could be helpful to my case?
Yes, it would be.
You understand my question?
I can remember that. Yes, she never told me that.
And again, my question is, you understand that if she had told you that information, you could certainly be helpful in my case, correct?
It would be, yes.
Thank you. No further questions? No further questions.
Excuse. Thank you.
Your Honor, we've completed People 77 testimony of Stephen Silverman. It's approximately noon. We can take an early lunch, or I can start the next video.
Well, we still have more than 15 minutes.
All right. Marking as People 78, testimony of Robin Morris.
You know what, let's do,
Exhibits? Were there any?
No.
On Silverman? Just the, okay, so 78, no? Which are you gonna? Robin Moore? Morris?
Goldberg.
Just kidding. We're going to play the video of Danny Goldberg. People 78.
78 is Danny Goldberg, okay.
Transcript is 78A.
I got one. Did you want?
Honor, I'm playing People 78, testimony of Danny Goldberg. It's approximately 40 minutes.
Okay.
Please come stand in the witness stand. Please come stand in the witness stand, please. Thank you. Please raise your right hand. You solemnly state that the testimony you're about to give in the cause not pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Please be seated. Please state and spell your first and last name.
Daniel, D-A-N-I-E-L. Goldberg, G-O-L-D-B-E-R-G.
Thank you.
Mr. Lynn, you may proceed.
Excuse me. Good afternoon, Mr. Goldberg.
Hi.
Can you tell me, when I say the name Susan Berman, is that somebody that you were familiar with?
Yes.
Can you tell me how did you know her?
I met her in the 70s. I think it was either 76 or 77. She was a journalist and I was a PR person and pitched her own story. And after that, we became friends. We stayed in touch until she died.
And where did you meet her? What city was it in?
New York City.
And you said you were a PR person. What kind of PR were you doing?
I had my own firm. We represented rock and rollers. And
when you say you were pitching her a story, you were pitching her as a journalist, a story on one of your bands?
yeah, one of my clients was called Electric Light Orchestra, and I was calling people who wrote about music, trying to get to do stories about their new album, and she did one.
And at the time that you met her, you said that the two of you became friends?
Yeah.
Can you describe what that relationship was like and how well did you know her?
You know, it varied. Up until about the mid-'80s, we were in closer touch, and then after that, I would see her maybe a few times a year. At a certain point, I started spending more and more time in Los Angeles, and but you know, I would always see her at least a couple times a year and be in touch by phone periodically.
Was your relationship, did it always stay simply platonic, or at a point in time did it develop into something more?
We briefly dated in the late 70s. It didn't last long.
Did you remain friends after that?
Yeah, we remained friends for the rest of our life.
And if I were to ask you to describe, what was Susan's personality like?
Very, very smart, funny, intense.
Intelligent person?
Yeah, very smart.
Somebody who, if I were to ask you, and you're in the business, so to speak, correct?
Which business?
Well, you represent musical acts, correct?
Correct.
So I would assume that that has a little bit of Hollywood connection as well, to some degree, with music and acting, etc.
There are some musicians who act and some actors who play music, but culturally it's a pretty different group of people acting compared to musicians.
Is it fair to say that in your line of work that there are some people that you deal with, clients, friends, adversaries, who can be more of the high maintenance variety?
Yes.
And if I were to ask you, was Susan kind of an easy friend, or was Susan somebody who could be more on the high maintenance end?
Somewhere in between. You know, she's tightly wound, but a good friend.
Were you aware, did Susan, when you were, did she have any phobias?
She was scared of going over bridges. I remember that was a phobia that she had.
At the time that you knew her, did the phobias that she had, did those disrupt her life in any meaningful way, or not really?
Not to my knowledge.
The Susan that you knew in terms of her personality, did it stay the same when you met her in the late 70s as it was near the end, or did she change at all?
She had the same personality. I mean, she had different events in her life that happened, but she was the same personality.
Is it fair to say that when we first met Susan, the kind of the arc of her professional life was kind of on the way up?
Yes.
Is it fair to say that at the end, the arc of professional life is clearly in a downward spiral?
Well, she wasn't as successful the last few years of her life as she was the first few years that I knew her, but she was always optimistic about a new project and things like that.
If I were to ask you, did you know who Susie's friends were?
I know some of her friends.
Did you know Julie Bongold?
Yeah, I met Julie Bongold with Susan, yes.
Did you know Liz Rosenberg?
Yes.
Hillary Johnson?
I think I met Hillary Johnson once or twice.
Kim Langford?
Yes.
When I say the name Nick Chapin, is that somebody that you know?
It doesn't ring a bell to me now.
What about Linda Obst?
Yes.
What about Robert Durst?
Yes.
If I were to ask you, when do you think you first heard the name Robert Durst? Do you remember?
It would have probably been the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. Once I got to know Susan fairly early in the relationship, she mentioned she was called Bobby Durst as a close friend of hers.
And how would Susan talk about Bobby Durst?
She talked about him as one of her best friends and often said he was like a brother to her.
And did you ever see the two of them together?
Yes.
And can you describe when you saw them together? How did they interact?
In a friendly way.
And is it fair to say that the two of them had a relationship that was kind of similar to brother and sister?
Well, that's how she described the relationship.
And when you saw them interact, is that how it appeared to be to you when you saw the interaction?
I don't know how to answer that. They seemed like friendly with each other and old friends.
When you said you met Robert Durst, do you remember when this would have been approximately, what decade?
It would have either been the end of the 70s or the beginning of the 80s. I know he threw a book party for her in the early 80s, for sure, so I know I saw him there, and I think there were a couple of other times around that time, plus or minus.
Was that in New York City?
That was in New York City.
And did you attend that as well?
Yes.
When I say that her name Kathy Durst, is that somebody you're familiar with?
Yes.
And did you actually meet her as well?
I did meet her. I'm pretty sure she was at a party. I remember meeting her briefly once or twice.
If I were to ask you to describe Bob Durst's personality, how would you describe it?
I don't know how to describe it. I didn't know him that well. You know, he seemed like a regular person.
Was he, when you met him, was he friendly?
Yes.
Were you able to have a conversation with him?
Yeah.
Did he have any difficulty relating to you?
I don't know. We didn't talk that much.
But were you were able to carry on a conversation with him?
Yes.
And in looking back, I just want to make sure you're telling me that you didn't really notice anything odd or different. He was just someone you spoke to.
I would say that's correct. It was not somebody I got to know particularly well. I just always met him with Susan.
When you met him, or when Susan talked about him, did you know that he was wealthy?
Yes.
And how did you know that?
She told me that. She told me that his family was a very successful real estate family.
And was that something that Susan volunteered to you early about him?
Yes.
Did Susan make a big deal of the amount of money that Durst had?
She always would mention people's families, and she did have an interest, and if their families had money or not. There's no question that she knew that mentioned his father and that the family was very successful in real estate and wealthy. I wouldn't say that she repeated that or anything like that, but it's certainly something she mentioned.
Let me ask you, to the best of your memory, would that have been something you would have asked her about? In other words, would you have said, hey, listen, Bobby, what's his financial situation? Or would that have been something that she would have volunteered to you?
I feel she volunteered it in the context of explaining who he was to me.
When I say, they let you know Kathy Durst and Kathy Durst's disappearance, is that an event that you're familiar with?
Yes.
And remember, how did you first hear about Kathy's disappearance?
I'm pretty sure Susan told me It's possible I read about it in the newspaper, but I'm pretty sure that she told me about it.
And do you believe that you would have heard about it, what I'm going to call in real time, in other words, back at the time it happened?
Yes.
Do you recall what, if anything, Susan told you about it?
I don't really remember except just that it was a big deal, and that she was talking to Bobby a lot about it, and confidant of his, consoling him or something like that. That was about it.
Did she tell you at the time that she was his media spokesman?
I don't remember her using those words.
Have you ever used those words to describe what Susan told you?
I might have. I mean, I think she did, as I recall, help him with the media.
So if you recall having an interview over the phone with myself and Detective Blanca Lopez, the LA Police Department on February 20th, 2015, does that sound about right?
Yeah, I don't remember the date, but I remember having an interview with you on the phone approximately at that time.
If you would have said during that interview that Susie was his media spokesman, you would not have said that unless you believed it to be true.
Yeah, that's my opinion of the role that she played.
And you wouldn't have had that information from anybody else but Susie, is that correct?
There's been so much publicity over the years, it's hard for me to know, but that's definitely my impression, and that's the role that I feel she played, and I believe I was aware of that at that time.
Do you remember telling me on that same day, Detective Lopez, that Susan Berman had told you that she was there to help Bob and to deal with his grief and his accusations?
That sounds right.
Is that your memory as you sit here today?
Yes.
Did you ever discuss Kathy's...
Your Honor, it's about the June hour. I'll stop the video at 12 minutes and 3 seconds.
Very good. We'll take our lunch break.
Ladies and gentlemen, do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case. 1:30 p.m.